Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we are going to talk about why card games are not balanced. So this is a video that I think works for every single card game and also to some extent to every single competitive game out there. And in this video I'm going to try to explain the reason why card games in general are not balanced, which I think is a subject that is particularly important those days, since there's obviously a lot of criticism towards Fantasy Flight game for yet again another very bad meta that we are heading towards, which is the Django meta that we're in right now. So if people are expecting my videos about whether or not Django should be banned, I'm going to wait for the Liverpool/Denver weekend before making that video. So we can have more data about how the deck actually performs, especially in an environment where everybody's going to try to counter it, and I think it's going to make for a much more relevant video. So look forward to see that. But in the meantime, I want to work a little bit on this because there's been a lot of people being very harsh towards Fantasy Flight games for the current stage of the game. And obviously, FFG is responsible for the situation, and there's definitely some stuff that could have been avoided. But I also want to provide a bit more context in why as the reason why we're seeing imbalances in card games happening every so often. And so then people can be a little bit more informed about the context in which those games are being worked on, and that can manage their expectations as well. So hopefully you guys learned something from this video. And I also want to say that the reason why I'm saying this for card games in general is because those kind of stuff happens in every single card games. And as a general rule of thumb, when a phenomenon happens on every single game, in every single thing to some extent, this means that there's a systemic issue. There's something in the system that makes this happening over and over again. And we're gonna look at those systematic issues in this video. So this video, as usual, is sponsored by Card Market, the biggest marketplace in Europe. So first of all, let's talk about the first reason why card games are very difficult to balance. The first reason is because game designers do not prioritize balance in card games. They prioritize deck building because at the end of the day, the most important part of card games is the creativity, is the idea of having all those cards and trying to create great and unique decks. Generally speaking, there are two ways to balance a game. The first way is that you're going to be talking about an asymmetrical game. So specifically, asymmetrical games is a game where the two players have different strengths, start the game different from one another. So example of a symmetrical game, chess is a symmetrical game, even though, okay, white and black, white always starts the game. But outside of this, it's a mostly symmetrical game. Obviously, most games, modern games, are asymmetrical. It's because it's really fun to be able to start the game differently from your opponent and have a different playstyle. So there's basically two ways to balance an asymmetrical game. The first way is to create very few options and mix them as balanced as possible. So let's say, imagine I want to create a card game and I want to make this card game as balanced as possible. Well, the best way to do this would be that instead of a card pool of 200 cards, I would create a card pool of maybe 60 different cards. And I would also create very drastic deck building restrictions. And this way, it would make it so much easier to balance the game because the fewer options, the fewer things I have, the fewer different scenarios I have to take into account, and the fewer playtesting I will have to do to balance all those different options. The fewer options there is, the more balanced the game is. And the second way to balance the game is to create a lot of different options and hope that among all the different options that I've made, I hope that some of those will be competitive to some level and it's going to be result into a diverse metagame. So in this case, there's a notion of metagame where it's not the entire game that is competitive, it's only a sub-portion of the game that ends up being competitive, and that's what we call the meta. And in this case, we are hoping that we're creating lots of options, and we are hoping that among all those options, a certain amount of them will end up being competitive. And this is the option number 2 that is chosen by card games, and I'll explain you why in the reason. So first of all, Going for option number one results in creating a card with very small card pool and a much longer period of time between each of the release, and that would be extremely boring. It would make for a very, very bad deck building experience. So there are games like, for example, I think one of the most famous example of a very conservative kind of design of balance standpoint is StarCraft 2 or StarCraft 1, Brood War, whatever. And in this case, Blizzard made the choice to make a game that is very asymmetrical, but there's very few options. There's only 3 factions. There's only like 12 to 14 units per factions, and they never had any unit in the game. It's a very, very stable environment. So in this environment, even then, it's not easy to balance the game, but it becomes a lot easier to make sure that almost 100% of the game ends up being relevant, competitively speaking. But in the context of a card game, because card game is all about creativity, all about building your own decks, you cannot really go for that option. So almost every single TCG out there goes for the second method, which is to try to create loads of options and hope that as many as possible becomes competitive. And the problem of this system is like it creates very unpredictable outcome, because in this case you don't really have a lot of control over the balance of the game. You're kind of like putting a lot of ideas out there, you're putting a lot of content, a lot of stuff out there, and then you kind of do a little prayer and you hope that everything is going to turn out great, because it is not humanly possible to playtest every single option and every different possibilities in the game. There's just too many of them. So this is the reason why there's a bit of luck involved whenever you are balancing a card game. Obviously, there's different ways, there's different methods you can use to kind of limit certain aspects. You obviously having a great knowledge of card games and help a ton. So obviously there's a huge amount of skills involved, but there's also a part that you do not control completely. Because if that was the case, then there will be card games out there which would have no balance issue whatsoever, and we all know that's never the case. So the first argument is to say that there's just a critical mass of content that happens in card game that makes the game impossible to balance, and this is by design. This is because balance is not the ultimate priority. The ultimate priority is to make a fun game, and a fun game involves giving a lot of options, because deck building is the core part of what make a card game fun. The second basically limitations for designers and testers is their testing power. So the testing team is very, very tiny compared to the player base. So you're talking about dozens of individuals, maybe like if you're talking about a very large company like Magic the Gathering, maybe they have like 30 or 40 or 50 testers, but basically never more than basically always kind of in the area of double-digit testers for that game. That's obviously extremely tiny compared to the player base. Obviously, taking the entire player base as a comparison is not very fair, because not everybody is trying to optimize the game, not everybody is trying to play the game competitively. But even if you take into account the population of players that are actually trying to break the game, people who are actually researching the game, trying to make the best deck possible and play the game competitively, it still represents a gigantic amount of people compared to what you will see in the design team. So another limiting factors is that the testers have very limited time to playtest any given iteration of the game. Something that is very important to understand is that testers do not play with the same version of the game all the time, as opposed to us. When the game releases and we have 1 month between the release of the game, or between the full spoil of the expansion and the first tournament that comes out, that we have about a month, we are basically testing on the same version of the game for about a month. This never happens for testers, because whenever they are testing the game, the designers are constantly tweaking the game. They're constantly changing numbers, adding cards, removing cards, changing abilities, changing stats and stuff like this. That means they're not playtesting in a stable environment. Maybe at most they will basically play on about a week on any given version of the game. Obviously, I don't have any details on how exactly they make it work in FFG, but you can safely assume that they do not playtest on the same version of the game for a long period of time. So if you do a little bit of math here, you realize that if basically if you evaluate the amount of testing time in hours, you basically multiply the time in hour multiplied by the manpower and you get a number. So if you look at the players, so let's say the players get about a month. So let's say a player on average plays about an hour a day. That's obviously not accurate for everybody. Some do way more than that, some do way less, some don't play at all during the week, but then they will play 6 hours during the weekend. So it's just kind of an average. And I'm obviously not taking into account the entire player base. I'm basically getting a numbers of 40,000. Just to give you an information on basically on websites like Carabas, you would have like 80k unique user logging to the app. Basically, I'm taking about half of that as a conservative number. Some people don't play on those platforms. Some people just play on real life. Some people play on other platforms. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that basically 40,000 is kind of the number I came up with for the amount of players in the world that are basically playing this game relatively competitively, that are trying to optimize their deck and stuff, obviously. So I'm not taking into account kitchen table players, basically. So, and then you would get a number that's about 1,200,000 hours of testing. Now let's compare this to a team that's on the same version of the game, on the same iteration of the game. Now let's compare this to the designers. Well, the designers, they basically work like 5 hours a day. Let's say they have a full-time job. So they dedicate about 35 hours of testing. Then they have meetings and all the stuff that are not related to play testing. And there's about, let's say there are about 10 of them in the team. Well, you see the amount of testing time they have on an iteration of the game would be 350 hours. That's a factor of, I don't know, this is a factor, like this is a massive, massive difference. And you can see that obviously a team that is so small with so little time, and I'm only taking a week here. Some people say, well, you should compare month by month, but the thing is, once again, they never work on an iteration of the game that is a month long that is the same. And you know that whenever you make a little change into a set, this can have a huge impact on the meta. So obviously it's not fair to, I think, as I said, I don't think they work more than a week on one iteration of the game, which means that the amount of playtesting they can reasonably do is tiny, and that's assuming they do full-time testing, which might not be accurate. Maybe some people do, some people don't. It's very hard to know. It's just to give you an idea. Once again, even if this number is double that, even if it's like half of that, it doesn't change the massive difference that you're gonna get in terms of, obviously there's diminishing return. Like the more test, there's a moment where you reach a plateau where more testing doesn't have any impact on your findings, but I'm just trying to explain in a very simple way that the amount of testing the player base is able to do is exponentially, massively bigger than what the testing can do. And that's the reason why the players will always find issues in the game much, much faster than the design team ever could be. So this is something that is very important to take into account. The third major issue, the major blocker for turning card games to make a balanced game is the lack of context. So as we know, cards are not good or bad in a vacuum. They are good or bad relative to a certain context. Look at Django, for example. When Django was spoiled in set 3, obviously we thought that this card was terrible. And the reason why we thought this card was terrible is because we were in a context where Boba Fett was legal. And there were just simply no reason to play Django Fett in an environment where Boba was legal. Then after that, Boba got banned. Suddenly Django became a lot more attractive. And then obviously we saw P38 got added to the game and stuff like that. But the deck was very competitive, but it was like the third most successful deck of set 3, basically. And then we of course saw everything that was added from set 4 that basically turned Django into a giant killing machine. So as you can see here, one same card, and in one context the card is mediocre, and in another context the card is the best card in the game, the best leader in the game. So you see, a card is never good or bad in a vacuum, it's always relative to a context. And that's the reason why in my first impression videos, or even in my videos where I'm reviewing the cards, like about a week before the release of the game, those evaluations are not very reliable, because I don't have a meta context. And without a meta context, it's very difficult to make accurate prediction of what is going to be strong and what is going to be good. So it's very hard to evaluate and therefore balance a card without a context. And yet that's exactly what the design team have to do. They have to constantly make a call and balance cards even though they have no idea what the meta is going to be. I mean, they can have an idea, basic idea, but because for them, they have to work in expansions multiple months in advance. The game is basically constantly being adjusted. As I was saying earlier, it's very hard to have a defined meta where the game changes all the time. And once again, without a defined meta, it's extremely difficult to predict the meta and therefore balance the game. And another point I want to add to this is that not only are they working on an ever-changing set, they are also working very far forward in advance. So basically, when we evaluate cards, at least we have the context of a very solid established meta from the previous set. So we are working on very solid base, while they are not working on solid base, because whenever they're playtesting set 7, they are basically playtesting, they have to work on what they imagine the meta on set 5 and set 6 is going to be. Very, very difficult to do because there's so many things that can change. So basically, they are working on the basis that we don't have, that we have, and they don't have that base. So for them, it's very, very difficult to predict the meta because they have to predict the meta multiple sets in advance, which is almost impossible. So that's a very, very important point, the lack of context. So yeah, sets are designed several years in advance and can only be adjusted about 6 months before they come out. So this is another point as well, is that they can adjust set after they designed it, but they can only do this 6 months in advance. And even when they do this, it can backfire, which we will explain later on. So it's a very, very, very big important point. The next point I want to raise is the multiple priorities. Testers' job is not only to playtest the balance of the Premier format. There's many other things they have to test whenever they're playtesting cards. First of all, they are testing the wording. So for example, making sure that everything is worded consistently and in mixed rules within the context of the game. Basically, making a game is almost like inventing a new language where every word has a very specific meaning within the rules. They have to make sure that the cards operate the way they should be. Sometimes there's things that you want to do on a card, you are basically putting the words on the card, and then you realize that it doesn't actually work once you actually follow the rules. They have to make sure the cards are fun and thematic, obviously. They have to test the starter decks. Starter decks is the onboarding experience of the game, so it's very, very important that the starter sets are balanced and fun to play with, because that's the very first thing people are going to be playing whenever they start playing Star Wars Unlimited. So that's very important. They also have to test Twin Suns to some extent, make sure that some cards are not just completely terrible and can ruin the Twin Suns experience. They have to also playtest the drafting experience. They have to make sure that the sets is fun to draft with. That's another immense amount of time sink that they have to spend in that specific area. And they also spend a lot of time, so to summarize, they spend a lot of time and attention and energy on things that are not related to the balance of the Premier format. So they already don't have a lot of time, but they also have to mind other aspects of the game that are not related to just competitive Premier format. I also wanted to add a more specific reason that might have caused issues for the balance of set 4, and this is related to the recalibration. If you remember, they've written an article a little bit before the release of the set where they said that they basically were kind of recalibrating sets because they realized that Star Wars Limited was suffering from an issue of power decreep where expansions were simply just not strong enough to add new blood to the meta. And this is a problem we had in set 3, which was way too weak, and they wanted to adjust that. This is why they've done to recalibration. And as I said earlier, yes, you can basically change, they can kind of like change the sets about 6 months before the release, which is an eternity on the scale of a card game, because at that point the set is not even out yet. The set that is even before the set that you're recalibrating is not even out yet. So it's very, very difficult. But not only that, you are creating a lot of stress where you have to playtest we have to make changes, you have to improve certain things, but you really don't have the time to playtest them thoroughly as much as you would if you were designing this set multiple years in advance. So Recalibration clearly backfired on set 4 is probably. So my opinion is like, I think it was very good that they wanted to push the power level of the set, because I think a set similar to set 3 would have been very, very bad for the game. So I think this was a very good initiative, and unfortunately the last minute change are dangerous since they are hard to test thoroughly, and unfortunately it backfired. I think this is kind of, obviously I don't have any insight about what actually happened, but if I had to imagine the reason why we are encountering those issues, the reason why War Juggernaut is that they were so much support for Django, is that they didn't have time to thoroughly playtest. They probably did buff a couple of those cards in the last minute, and then they didn't realize how much of an impact it had on Django. And I think this is what happened. I personally, I hope that they will continue to make powerful sets, but I hope they will do it from the conception of the set, not as a last minute fix. I hope that right from the get-go, they will try to push the power of the card and then have enough time to adjust and really refine those cards to find the right balance, instead of having to push the power level of the card as a kind of a last minute fix, which is probably what happened in set 4 and what is causing such massive issues. So before we get into the conclusion of this video, I just would like to tell you that you can pick up the most balanced card of set 4, the Devastator, for only €21 on Card Market. Yeah, a good example of a card that probably was pushed to just a little bit too much. So what is the conclusion of that? The conclusion is that there are many obstacles for a balanced TCG. The first one is that there's too much content to test in a TCG, and this is by design, is because content is very, very important. Not only a TCG need a lot of content to properly work, and they also need constant update. The lack of manpower, employees are very expensive, and investing more money into more playtesters is gonna improve things, but it's not even guaranteed to really help out that much, and it is costing a lot of money to have people working for you full time. The lack of time, they have to release and design expansion years in advance because of the production pipeline, to have that the factory has to produce those items and all that stuff. All this creates huge limitations in terms of time, and unlike a digital card game, physical card games, you cannot adjust the card once they're printed. You cannot adjust the card by doing a patch, and you cannot just tweak card until the last minute before you push the new game. While you have to design and make sure everything is up and running several months before the release of the game. And not only that, of course, time is also money. You cannot just playtest the game forever. You have to release new expansion, and you have to create content often so people don't lose interest in the game. Then there's also a lack of context or lack of an established meta. The fact that they have to design multiple sets in advance and so far forward in advance mean that they don't have any meta to stand by, and they don't have anything that allow them to kind of work on the game on a very solid basis. They have to work on assumptions of what on what they predict the meta they're going to be, and that's extremely difficult to do, even for a very seasoned player like me. Just before the release of the set, it's very hard for me to predict what the meta is going to be. For them, it must be very, very difficult, even more so than for me. Then also they have, of course, the many other priorities that they have to mind for the game to be successful. And they also, the ability to adjust the game last minute can backfire. And when I say last minute, I say like 6 months before the release of the game. It's not even a real last minute. And obviously the fact that they can't really thoroughly playtest it means that this can really, really backfire. So for all those reasons, balancing a TCG is very difficult, and unless a massive technological breakthrough happens, it will continue to be so. Basically, what I mean by a technological breakthrough, I can imagine a world where, let's say, we would be able to create AI that would be able to play the game even better than a human can be, which is already possible. And if you use those AI to playtest the game, they can playtest much, much more than you can, than any testing team would ever be able to do, and can kind of playtest the game so much that you'll be able to find potentially a perfect balance before the game is even out. So theoretically, it is possible to balance a game perfectly before it comes out using AI, but currently there's no company that I know of that is capable of having that kind of technology. It would obviously take tremendous amount of time to train an AI to play the game perfectly, and to be able to adapt to all those cards. And yeah, so this is something that it's a thing to be looking forward in the future, but as I'm speaking today, this is not something that they do on Fantasy Flight game, or something that they do in any game for that matter, because this could be a way they could actually balance the game, but currently that's not what they have. They have to rely on human beings, and that's obviously very costly and very imperfect. Expansion balance comes down to mostly luck. The best we can hope for in each expansion is to be fun to play and offers enough option to experiment and hope for a quick ban from FFG if a meta turns out bad. So basically the best FFG can do is basically damage control. Trying to make an expansion is fun to play with a lot of options. Try to make those options as competitive as possible without making them too OP, and hope that the meta is gonna turn fine. That's basically the best they can do, and that's a very, very imperfect approach, and that's an approach that obviously will result in, from time to time, to have imbalances. And we are hoping that it's gonna happen as little as possible, but it is always a risk whenever you're trying to push the power level of the card. And the problem is, like, if you don't, you end up in the situation that we had in set 3, where no card is good and the meta is extremely stale. This whole debate kind of reminds me of a conversation that I had. Basically, I made a video where I was talking about the meta back in set 1, and in set 1, basically almost everybody was really agreed that the game was very well balanced and the meta was very enjoyable. And then I've basically someone answered and told me, well, the designers did a really, really great job at designing the set. And what I said at this moment is that basically the designers probably did not expect the set 1 to be that balanced, because and it's most likely an happy accident that the meta is that balanced, because I'm very aware of what it is to design a TCG. I'm very aware of the limitations and the difficulties that comes to this, and I know that even though they did a really good job with set 1, there's always a luck factors into what the meta is going to turn out to be, because as I said earlier, you don't have perfect control. And this goes both ways. When things go bad, you can kind of say, well, it is you can kind of like push the responsibility aside and say, well, we try our best, but we don't have perfect control. But this is also true on the other way. When things turn out very well, you can't really say. And back in the days, Jeremy Zarn, which is actually one of the designers of the game, said that he wouldn't say that the meta is an happy accident at all, that they put a lot of time and effort. And so basically he tried to take credit for the fact that set 1 was super balanced, which is fine. I mean, obviously you can do that, but in my head, I thought, I was like, really, dude? Like be careful about what you wish for, because by saying this, you're basically telling us that indeed the designers have complete control over the balance of the game. And if you're saying that, you need to accept it to go both ways. So here the meta set 1 turned out very well, congratulations, but then what if it's not? Then people have the right to blame you. And I'm on the camp of saying you shouldn't be blaming the designers when things are great. I mean, once again, to some extent you will, but to some extent you were gonna say, well, okay, this meta turned out great, there's a bit of luck involved in there. And it goes the other way around. It's like, you did a great job with set 4, unfortunately you did some recalibration and unfortunately it didn't turn out well, and it's a little bit unlucky, and now it's all about your reaction to it that matters. So what I'm trying to say is that the designers, unless what Jeremy Zarn is kind of like suggesting here, which in my opinion is wrong, designers don't have a perfect control about how the set is turning out, and there's always a very important luck factor involved into designing a TCG and designing a set for a TCG. So this is something I wanted to emphasize on, and just so you can manage your expectations for the future of the game and understand that there's no such thing as perfect balance, and that a card game will never be perfectly balanced. But that's not even what people are asking. People are just asking for a decent meta, but there's always going to be, every once in a while, there's going to be something that turns out and breaks the game, and it's tier 0. And to me, what really matters is the ability to create exciting and fun gameplay that is relatively balanced, and I accept the risk that sometimes things are going to turn it bad, especially when you want to push the power level of the cards a little bit. And for me, what really matters is the reaction from FFG. I want FFG to be very reactive, so I know that this weekend is going to be this weekend is going to be the Liverpool tournaments with Denver, and if things don't turn out well on this set, I want a very quick reaction from FFG on that. So thank you so much for following that video. Let me know if you agree with what I'm saying in this video in terms of the balance of the game. Have you learned anything about this video? Please let me know, and I'll see you next time.